Okay, well, we'll make a start. So welcome everyone to this webinar for World Green Building Week on zero carbon tenants. Is it possible? My name's David Clark. I'm a partner with Cundall and I'll be the sort of host and moderator today. But before I introduce the panelists, I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all joining this meeting from today and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So Cundall's leading a series of events globally in the lead up to COP26 in Glasgow in November. And as part of that, we'll be conducting an audience poll. So we'll bring that up in a short while. And before I introduce the panel, there are a couple of housekeeping items that I need to attend to. So first of all, this webinar is being recorded and will be available to download in a couple of days' time. We will try and have a Q&A session at the end. So in the Zoom Q&A box, if you want to type in some questions, if you can put them in there rather than in the chat, we'll endeavour to get to those, and those that we can't answer, we'll try and get a response back to you afterwards. And if you're having any tech issues, then please email Meg or Ali at the Cundall login details for this, and they'll endeavour to help sort things out. So I'd now like to introduce the panel. So first of all, Stephen Choi from Fraser's Property. He's the Living Building Challenge Manager and at Burwood Brickworks. Michelle Turney, the Chief Operating Officer of the SCA Property Group. David Palin, the Sustainability Manager at Mirvac. Taryn Cornell, Senior Manager of Green Star Strategy and Development at the Green Building Council of Australia. And Mohammed Ali, Director and Head of Building Services Australia for Cundall. And before we start the panel discussion, I'm going to ask each of these panelists to give us a brief overview of what zero carbon means for their company before we crack on with the discussion around zero carbon tenants. So to kick things off, over to you, Mo.
Thank you very much, David. I'd like to introduce myself to everyone. As David has said, my name's Mohammed Ali and I head up the building services team nationally for Cundall, and I'm a director of the business and been in the industry for over 20 years. So a little bit from our perspective of Cundall about what net zero carbon means. In 2018, we were founding signatories of the World Green Building Council Net Zero Carbon Building Commitment, which now has over 100 companies signed up globally. Last week, our commitment as a business also expanded to include embodied carbon to zero by 2030, as well as scope 1 and 2 for operating energy emissions. Our key role as engineers and as advisors is to be proactive and provide the right advice to our clients on projects and on events like these today. We're also a carbon neutral certified business. So what that is, in 2019, we became a carbon neutral certified business with Climate Active for our 5 offices Australia-wide. And in 2020, we were the first engineering consultancy to globally be able to achieve that for all our offices in the UK, Europe, Middle East, Asia, and Australia. We are always looking at ways to reduce our energy consumption as a business, and we encourage engagement with our landlords to do this. Also, we have introduced an initiative within Cundall, which is the Zero Carbon Design by 2030. It's a global initiative for Cundall. We are looking to collaborate with our clients and our industry to find ways to provide solutions to keep global heat below 1.5 degrees. After 2030, Cundall's aim is to work on zero carbon projects moving forward. This goal is set for every aspect of what Cundall does: structural engineering, building services, lighting design, acoustic consultancy, and everyone in every office at every time. The approach we're taking by doing this is a bottom-up approach. We're focusing with our teams in every location to be able to provide strategies and directions on how to achieve this. We understand not every size fits every location, and not every approach fits every location. So we're working together to come with creative and to encourage creative and lateral thinking to achieve this. We're also developing training programs internally within Cundall to guide our teams and to help deliver this. And we're hoping to share that with the industry as we move forward. We also recognise that achieving net carbon zero is not something you're going to do today, and we've set ourselves a nine-year timeframe to achieve this. Our first milestone is by end of 2022 to be able to work on a clear pathway for zero carbon.
Thanks, Mo. David.
Thanks, David. Hi, everybody. My name is Dave Pell. I'm Sustainability Manager for Mirvac. David, could we pop on to the next slide, please? Just a quick intro to Mirvac. We're a diversified real estate company. We work across several sectors of the market. That's residential, office, retail, industrial, and now the new build to rent sector. Our sustainability strategy is called This Changes Everything. This was developed in 2014. And one of the key targets, the major pillars of this strategy, is to be net positive carbon by 2030 or before. For transparency, maybe if we could flick back a couple of slides, David.
Sorry.
Thank you. One of the key targets is to be net positive by 2030, and really just for transparency, this target is for Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. There's 4 main elements to the net positive carbon targets. The first one is energy efficiency. We strongly believe that the cheapest kilowatt hour is the one you don't use. It's been our mantra for some years, and we achieved a 20% reduction in carbon intensity through a strong focus on energy efficiency. Another big pillar is purchasing renewable energy or renewable electricity, and last year we managed to purchase 84% of our electricity from renewable generation. Combined the energy efficiency and renewables together, we've reduced emissions by almost 80% from 2013, which is our baseline year, which equates to approximately 60,000 tons of CO2 removed per annum, and we're continuing to push ahead. In terms of our tenants, wherever we have embedded networks, we on-sell renewable electricity to our tenants, and this further reduced emissions. It was by approximately 50,000 tons of CO2 per annum. And we've installed almost a megawatt of solar PV in our industrial portfolio directly to reduce tenant emissions. In terms of new developments, they're going to be all electric, and we've started to remove gas infrastructure from the existing assets. And we're gearing up to make our first carbon offset purchases for Scope 1 emissions. If we could just pop to the next slide, please, David. So this just really quickly on this one, it's just a quick word on Scope 3. We didn't want to miss this piece out because it is very important. So we are working on Scope 3 emissions. We're working on the embodied emissions through our zero waste to landfill target. So we're targeting 25% recycled content in major materials to reduce the embodied carbon in embodied water, but also to support circular economy principles and to provide value for waste materials and divert them away from landfill, which then also helps our operational business. Essentially, we're looking for a win-win and opportunities, kind of like having birthday and Christmas all together. That's it for me, David. I'll hand back. Thank you.
And over to you, Michelle.
Thanks, David. Thank you. I am the Chief Operating Officer of SCA Property Group. SCA Property Group is the owner of about 100 odd shopping centres, neighbourhood shopping centres largely, right across Australia, predominantly located in regional areas of Australia. We've grown considerably since we listed in 2012, and we have continued to grow very substantially. We recognise that as we grow, so does our impact on the environment. And so hence we started measuring water waste and energy usage in 2015. A little bit behind David, but nonetheless, we are definitely on the journey. I've been with SCA now a little over 2 years, and in 2021, we saw the opportunity to review our targets and our strategy to really enable us, I guess, to make a bigger difference over the next decade and launch target strategy and commitments to 2030. I'd like to give a call out actually to Cundall, who were instrumental in working with us in particular around our journey to net zero. But effectively, we're targeting our efforts in 6 key areas where we think we can have the maximum impact, whilst enhancing ours and and others' sustainable economic sustainability in the communities in which we operate. So I'm going to profess to go through that. Perhaps if we pop to the next slide, David. You can read it all in detail in our sustainability report, of course. So these new sustainability targets are by far and away the boldest in the history of SCA, and in particular, we're most proud of our commitment to net zero carbon emissions by 2030, as I said, which Cundall were instrumental in assisting us to not only actually understand the landscape, but actually to really fundamentally to help us to understand that we could get there. And so we're particular about making sure that we could actually detail our pathway to reinforce our very genuine commitment. You can see there, we started a little bit, late probably in 2015, and you can see across where we are in 2021. Some of our major commitments are in 2022, we'll commit 7.5 megawatts of solar generation on our 7 West Australian assets, and that's a pilot. In 2023, we're looking to have LED lighting installed across all of our assets and our climate resilience action plans completed. And by 2025, we're looking to have 25 megawatts of total on-site solar generation installed, which leads us very nicely into achieving our net zero by 2030. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Michelle. And Stephen, over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stephen. I'm very gratefully on Wurundjeri country, where I guess I'm actually a tenant. I'm here representing Fraser's Property Australia. In the next slide, you'll be able to see just a little bit about the journey and a few snapshots. So as a company, carbon neutral certification with Climate Active, a lot of work on reducing energy use. In 2018, we committed to renewable energy in all new developments. 2023, we'll have our internal retailer, Real Utilities, supply 100% renewable energy. And 2028 is our commitment to zero carbon, inclusive of scopes 1, 2, and 3. I'm based as you see on the next slide, a shopping centre called the Burwood Brickworks. This is a building that is doing Living Building Challenge certification, which means it's net positive carbon in operation and embodied energy, inclusive of all tenants. One of the key things about that is really looking in depth at materials. We have I think, one of a kind list of materials that have been used at the building, thousands of products that were researched, and embodied carbon was one of those requirements, as well as obviously anything that uses electricity. This is actually being released to the public next week, I think. So if you want to find out about that, it's probably on some social media somewhere. Thanks, David.
Great, thanks, Stephen. And Taryn, over to you.
Thanks, David, and really excited to be here as well today and to hear from all of the beautiful panelists. I'm the Senior Manager of Green Star Strategy and Development at the GBCA. So my role is really looking at the development of the rating tools, in particular, obviously the future focus rating tools. And so just a bit of background before I get into the detail of this particular slide. We released Green Star Buildings late last year, which was a big overhaul of the new buildings rating tool. We're also looking at homes, performance, communities, and fit outs over the next couple of years. So there's lots of work and lots of development underway. As part of that process, we really wanted to drive outcomes in the rating tools around carbon. It's a strategic pillar for the GBCA. And so when we looked at what that meant for the Green Building Council and the industry, we defined that as being fossil fuel free, powered by renewables, highly efficient, with low upfront carbon, and offset with nature for those remaining emissions. That is looking at kind of the scope of a developer and what is within their control. But we also think that there's a really important part for developers to play in bringing tenants along the journey. And so as part of the rating tool, we've developed what we call sector-specific credits, which is essentially credits for sectors that have very specific issues that we want to address. So there's 2 of those credits that we developed, and with a lot of input from David Clark, who's the Technical Advisory Group Chair. So just acknowledge lots of input from David, thank you. The first of these is tenant energy source. So that's really helping tenants move the energy that they're using away from fossil fuel and onto renewables. So the credit really rewards having a mechanism that you can use to engage with tenants and to help them sign up for renewable electricity. And also getting a number of tenants to sign up for that. And then we're also rewarding for additional number of points, having a larger number of those tenants signed up, not only to renewable electricity, but removing that use of renewable of fossil fuels and being fully renewable from their energy sources. Next slide, please, David. The other one that we wanted to really drive home was upfront fit out emissions. So as I said earlier, we're looking at introducing, or we've introduced into the rating tool, the being built with lower upfront carbon emissions. And so it's important that because there's a lot of fit out churn within buildings, we're also looking at this aspect in buildings. So the outcome here is that the building owner is working with tenants to eliminate those upfront carbon emissions. You get a point for essentially, once again, creating a mechanism to allow projects or your tenants to quantify their emissions and then offset them. And we want you to have a few tenants sign up to demonstrate that that mechanism is working. Also looking at your refrigerant use and making sure that you're eliminating high GWP refrigerants or offsetting any that do exist. And then, the next step there is obviously getting a larger number of tenants signed up and reducing and offsetting those upfront carbon emissions. Next slide, please. The other thing that we're doing at the GBCA in support of this is really looking at practical guides for electrification. We know that electrification, there's a lot of activity happening in this space, but we also think it's really important to talk about, what all those barriers and opportunities are. And so with Cundall support, we're producing these two guides, one for new buildings and one for existing buildings. And hopefully I'll talk a bit more about those later, but yeah, they're really exciting. And, I think in terms of the tenant conversation, what that means for tenants, there's a lot to be said in that space.
Great, thanks very much, Taryn. So before I give a quick sort of overview of zero carbon tenants and we engage in the panel discussion, we'd like to do an audience poll, and if the technology is working, that should pop up on your screens now. Hopefully it has, because I can't see it. So the 4 questions, and these are questions that we're asking, there we go. These are questions that we're asking everybody globally across a series of these webinars and in-house seminars that we're running for World Building Week in our offices around the globe. Some of them are online like we are because we're all in lockdown, and others are in real life. But we're asking the same 4 questions. So does your business have net zero carbon targets? Are you currently working on projects that are net zero carbon? What are you seeing as the greatest drivers for net zero, and what would help you deliver net zero carbon faster? And there's a few just very simple drop-down questions there. So if you could answer those while I'm talking to the next few slides, and then we'll engage in the panel discussion, so we're not got the poll in the way of having a chat. So I think it's fair to say when we're talking about zero carbon is that the science has been right so far. It's been right for the last 20 years, and it's still right now. And everything that's been predicted is what we're seeing. Paris 2015 was a sort of fairly major landmark. Let's acknowledge this problem. Let's keep the temperature down to 1.5 degrees C. Unfortunately, all the current pledges that everybody has in place at the moment, governments and so on, we're still looking at a rise greater than 3 degrees C. We've got the COP26 in the UK, in Glasgow this year, where hopefully the governments of the world will make more firm commitments around this. But the new IPCC report that came out, for those of you that have read it, sets out a fairly bleak future if we don't really tackle this issue now and with a degree of urgency. So when we're talking about buildings have a major carbon footprint, and around the embodied carbon, the construction, the refurbishment, and the bit that's often missing in all of this is the fit out. Fit out, you might build a building, it might last 60 to 100 years, but a fit out can be only 5 years, 5 to 10 years. There's a lot of churn and a lot of waste in fit out. So how do we tackle embodied carbon and fit out? The building energy is a key component, and that includes the tenants. And then there's all the other emissions associated with where you put the buildings, the waste, the water consumption, and the travel, and so on. So there's looking at that complexity of the carbon footprint is really important, and often the tenants are missed out of this conversation. We're generally talking about sort of base building. Why is that important? In an office building, the tenant's energy consumption might be 40 to 50% of the total energy consumption in the building, but in retail, the tenants are a very significant component of the electricity consumption. In offices, there are only 260 neighbours ratings as of this morning for office tenants. So, our tenants really engaging in reducing energy consumption and becoming zero carbon. And I suppose what this panel today is going to discuss is how do landlords who manage and run and operate buildings engage with tenants to help them get to zero carbon. And what do we mean by that? How do landlords help tenants get rid of natural gas in buildings, particularly retail cooking? How do we help tenants reduce their energy consumption and then provide all of that electricity from renewable electricity? How can we help tenants reduce the embodied carbon of fit outs and look at waste, travel, emissions? How do we help them understand and navigate the complicated world of carbon offsets? So that's sort of setting the scene for what we're going to be talking about in this panel discussion. So if I stop sharing now. And so where do we start with all of this? So I think before we get into anything too technical, let's explore how landlords are engaging with their tenants in this conversation before we start even looking at the solutions. So first of all, I'm going to ask you, Michelle, SCA have got lots of regional shopping centres. You've got they've all got majors like Coles and Woolies who've set their own zero carbon targets. But what's happening with all the smaller retailers?
Thanks, David. Look, I'd say that from a specialty retailer perspective, and specifically in the SCA portfolio, we have some 2,000 odd retailers, and a lot of those would be mum and dad retailers. And I would say that, it has been probably a slower demand than, for example, specifically say in the office environment. But very pleasingly, we are starting to see more of an emerging trend from our mum and dad retailers asking us and expressing interest in, solar energy, for example, as opportunities. So some of the things that we are currently doing is, particularly around that, we're currently spending, as I said, $13 million on solar on our sites. Those retailers will have the opportunity to be energised, obviously during daylight generation hours by renewable energy generated on the roofs of those shopping centres. We also have completed sustainability roadshows across our portfolio, and we're a different portfolio to many in that we have outsourced property management providers. So we've roadshowed with our property managers, our facilities managers, and our operational and corporate teams. So some of the other things we are looking to do is to ensure that our fit out guides make more reference to sustainable options in terms of energy, but also in terms of materials, in terms of, potentially using recycled or secondhand appropriate, fit outs and fitments. And I guess the other thing that we're really looking to do this year is going to market for a green energy accredited embedded network partner so that we can sell energy from renewable resources directly to our retailers. So, I'd have to be honest in saying we're fairly early in the journey, specifically for specialty mum and dad retailers. but we're well and truly on the journey, and we are really encouraged that we're starting to get more demand, and we're really hoping that, you know, we can sort of push that message out more broadly in the marketplace.
Right. Thanks, Michelle. And then David, you've got like quite a broad portfolio: commercial, retail, industrial, and now the build to rent tenants. So how are you going? How's Mirvac going about sort of tackling that engagement with a fairly diverse range of tenants, and how many of them are currently asking for zero carbon solutions?
I think you're right, David. Hit it nail on the head there, and it is quite diverse, and we're seeing quite different drivers and quite different questions from those different sectors. If we're talking office tenants are quite sophisticated. They're asking for high neighbours and Green Star. And we've started to see a few prospective tenants start to talk about net zero in operations. So that's been really good to see. But there is a strong focus on Green Star and neighbours, which I think is a proxy for some of those discussions. In industrial, it's really strong focus on Green Star, and also a strong focus on having solar on the roof so that they can offset, or they can reduce and eliminate some of their emissions that way. So that's been a big focus in industrial. In retail, it's probably more zero carbon than about the rating tools themselves. So we've had a few there. I think it's quite nice that because we can on-sell renewables through our embedded networks, wherever we have an embedded network, we on-sell renewables. So like I said, that's made a big difference, probably about 50,000 tons of CO2 per annum that we wouldn't otherwise have been able to do. So that's been really good. And then the build to rent, because it is mums and dads essentially, you know, it is residential. It's probably a lot more talk around renewable energy and the ability to again access renewables through our embedded networks. So it's been very different drivers, very different engagements. You know, when you're talking to a mum and dad over at the Sydney Olympic Park, it's quite different than, say, talking to Westpac at 275 Kent Street. So it has been quite different, but we've actually noticed quite a difference in terms of what their drivers have been and what they're asking us.
Excellent. Thanks, David. And then Stephen at Burwood Brickworks, obviously it was fairly turbocharged there, the drive for zero carbon energy and zero carbon embodied carbon. So, you know, how did you find the process of engaging with tenants and getting them to do things quite differently in order to be part of that project?
It's a big question because there are many aspects to it. You know, both through the fit out, the way that you even think about how long you give people to fit out, the resources that you provide. You also have to think about you know, what should and shouldn't be in a lease, I think, a lot of the time, which dictates quite a lot of these, you know, the answers to this. One thing that we found really helpful is to be very clear with people and say, this is what we're going to do. Would you like to be involved, and how would you like to do it? And it's a very slow, very manual, very one-on-one process that depends if it's a yoga studio or a sushi bar. So there's no one size fits all. And it's also a bit arrogant to believe that a landlord is going to know better than a tenant in this space, because that's not always the case. And I think when you go in with that as an approach, you have quite a different outcome.
Oh, you're on mute there, I think, David.
Yeah.
Got to be one.
Classic. I've always got to do it once, haven't you? Are there any sort of tips you would offer in how to start that engagement process, or how not to do it?
Firstly, have really clear parameters. So, for example, and we might cover this later, but if you're using gas or not using gas, make that really clear. If you are going to tackle embodied energy, if you're going to look at design for disassembly, if parts of the fit out guide are actually going to be mandatory or are nice to have, firstly, it's really important to make those expectations clear and then really follow through on them. So I've never met a tenant who's not interested in trying to do better. I've not met a tenant that actually likes contributing to global warming. I know we like to think that there's a bunch of people who just don't care and they're all tenants. I don't think that's true. However, there are, you know, secondary supply chains that have different priorities. So once you've set out those parameters, one tip I would say is to like really strongly police them. So we've had situations on site where we've made contractors and shop fitters completely refit almost entire fit outs because they're not using the right thing or doing the right thing. And they can learn the easy way or the hard way. Some choose the hard way. But if you're always consistent in that way, and then also demonstrate the same things as a landlord and as a developer, then I think that's a really good kind of footing to say it's not a master and slave relationship, tenant and landlord, it's a partnership relationship. And if you have that mindset, that flows through to everything, the environmental schedules, the way that you work with them during a fit out process, in operation, throughout the way they manage waste, energy, water, etc. If you're always thinking of that in partnership terms, where you've got a shared goal essentially, and you can't do it without them, then that's really powerful.
Excellent. No, and I think that you're absolutely right. That partnership is the key. You know, we've just moved office last week in Sydney. You know, and it's fair to say our landlord's not exactly encouraging us to do zero carbon. It's quite a stressful thing when you're moving office. There's lots of things to sort out, and any assistance and you can get to help smooth that process would be really valuable. I think one of the, I suppose, the key first steps to zero carbon for tenants is this eliminating of fossil fuels. And, you know, while landlords can decide to replace the gas boilers with heat pumps for space heating and domestic hot water, and that really has no impact on the tenants at all, it gets very different when you start telling your tenants what they can and can't cook with, and what, you know, if you tell a tenant that you can't cook with gas, that's quite an interesting conversation to be had, particularly in the retail space. So Mo, I'd just like to put a question to you. So from a building services sort of engineering perspective, what are the impacts from switching from gas to electric cooking on things like the electrical and the mechanical system design in buildings? What do landlords need to be thinking about?
Well, David, it's an interesting one, because obviously when we start moving away from gas cooking and we'll go towards electrical, using electrical devices to cook, you're going to be increasing your electrical demand. But in saying that, you need to enable the infrastructure of any building that you design to future-proof for that. So providing the infrastructure to cater for it, because it might not be happening at day one. There may be an increase in electrical demand that occurs, but the advantages of it is that you're removing things like gas meter rooms and the requirements for gas to be reticulated, which can give you some real estate space back. From a mechanical perspective, obviously cooking with gas inside enclosed spaces is not an ideal equation. As you cook with gas, pollutants come out and you require the extraction to remove that. You can get reduction in extraction if we can go to electric cooking, because then you're also not having all the heat being dissipated within the space. Electric cooking is a bit more efficient from a heat loss perspective, and then you could have potential reduction in ventilation requirements for exhaust and makeup air requirements, which can save you energy. And then the spaces are more comfortable for people that work in them, chefs, etc., that cook. So that's something to think about and to place as important value.
Excellent, thanks, Mo. And then Taryn, with the, you know, we talked about the new Green Star Buildings tool. You can't, basically to get a 6-star rated building, you can't have gas in the building at all for space heating or for hot water or for cooking. Obviously, this is a big challenge in retail. So I was just wondering, you know, could you give a quick overview of what the Green Building Council's view is on the trajectory to get gas out of buildings, and also some sort of insights that we've gained from the electrification guide and talking with various retailers about what are the challenges of switching from gas to other forms of cooking.
Yeah, I think also one thing that's important to note is that obviously 6-star buildings, it's a requirement right now to remove or, you know, to be fossil fuel free, but over time that will move down to 5- and 4-star rated buildings. So by 2030, you know, the rating tool is asking for all buildings. And I think in terms of some of the things we've talked about a little bit earlier, giving that forewarning is really important, and making sure that we're sending a very clear message that as you head towards 2030, eliminating those fossil fuels is absolutely key to getting on that net zero journey. It is obviously, though, the 6-star buildings that are going to be kind of facing those challenges up front, and shifting the dial on some of these things. And I think when we're looking at that electrification guide, it's been such a great project to work on, and it's been a really enjoyable series of conversations we've been having from everybody from investors all the way down to tenants and occupants of buildings. I think broadly there are kind of for developers and landlords, there's sort of three areas of barriers or potential challenges, and they sort of fall under the getting the building off the ground aspect of investment and concern around return on investment, authority approval, and those sorts of things. There's the kind of middle piece, which is the technology, which is really what Mo was talking about. Some of those solutions can be a bit of an issue, but then really what we're looking at is that third part is the tenant and occupant part of the question, and the challenges associated with removing gas from buildings there. And I think what's been really interesting about that conversation is that, particularly if you're looking at retail, which is a big consumer of gas in buildings, there are some technological challenges. We haven't fully made electric cooking the most, there's still, I guess, some challenges there around equipment and making that available. There's a whole supply chain specifically related to retail cooking, but I think largely a lot of those barriers and challenges tend to fall around education and training. So making sure people actually even understanding how to use electrical equipment is a big part of that, but also that behavior change aspect. So I think there's some kind of embedded understanding of people think that gas is cheaper, that it's more efficient, that it cooks better, and I think there's a real opportunity there for landlords to talk to tenants about the benefits of all electric cooking, which is really, as Mo kind of touched on, there's IQ benefits. It's much nicer to work in a kitchen that's all electric because there's not as much heat demand, and also opportunity for better extraction, which I think is kind of important in a COVID environment where we're talking a lot about the kind of air quality and those sorts of things. Safety, there's a few things around safety as well, and I think when you've got retailers who are under a pretty stressful economic environment because of COVID, being able to deliver them some of these solutions and help them with these solutions, I think is it's a really key point of differentiation for a developer and a landlord.
Excellent. Thanks, Taryn. And Stephen, you've been at the front end of this, the work at Burwood Brickworks to start shifting retailers off gas, a few years ago was really ahead of its time and sort of showing that it is possible, although not necessarily that easy, but is possible. So what lessons have you learned along the way doing that? And if you were going to do it again now, would you do anything slightly differently?
Yeah, it was ahead of its time, and that wasn't a good thing necessarily as a participant. I think, as I mentioned earlier, we have to try and be wary of arrogance when it comes to thinking we know better for tenants. I've stood in many kitchens, and it is a different process in some cooking styles. There are also some cultural reasons why people want to use a flame versus electric. Have you ever tried to char grill a chicken, without a flame? It's different. The electrical equipment as a replacement for gas generally is less available and certainly more expensive in many cases as a capital upfront cost. And then, the additional electrical infrastructure does play into it. If you don't bring gas into a development at all, and I think it's great that GPCA have pushed for that, because that's a really powerful statement. It changes the overall feasibility of a development at that kind of civil level all the way down to the individual. I can tell you now, though, that the number of tenants that Brickworks never signed up because they demanded gas. We've never once had a laundry or dry cleaner, because we're yet to find a non-gas dry cleaning commercial scale service in Australia. Certainly not in Melbourne, and no one who's willing to do that without gas. Sorry. And then there are sort of, in terms of commercial cooking, there are quite a few, tenants that will say, we'd prefer you to not use gas for these reasons. You can give all the reasons you like, but if someone's standing there with a wok tossing a piece of food that is made in a very traditional way, in their tradition, the electric version of that is not the same experience for them. And so we have to be really wary that unless we're chefs in a kitchen, we can't necessarily know that. There are some really positive stories though. So for example, we've got a sushi operator who wanted to use gas to, deep fry tempura. I know this is really detailed, but I can't help myself. And we said to them, look, if you switch to this electric option, we'll also get to remove your exhaust entirely, which will free up the space above your head. It will look a lot nicer in the fit out, and it'll be cheaper overall. Plus, we've got the embedded electrical network, which helps. And we've also got an embedded thermal network. So we're not, as Mo sort of touched on, over conditioning a building to compensate for cooking, which its main purpose is to heat food, not heat the space. So all of those things have to play in together at the same time. And electric cooking at commercial scale will come, and it's changed so much even in the last 12 months. It's really great to see. We had a really difficult time with it because 5 years ago it was a very different place. But there are some other areas beyond cooking, as I mentioned, like the laundrette, which we're yet to see some really, really radical changes there too.
So if there's any laundrette equipment manufacturers on this call, I'm sure there's quite a few. There's a huge opportunity in the market there. David, so the picking up on the what cooking, that's often something that we comes across when you in residential, and so I'm thinking particularly in the sort of the build to rent tenancy space. Have you seen any issues there with shifting from gas to say induction cooktops, and any sort of pushback from people that like to cook in and woks are the one that's always sort of comes up in these conversations?
Yeah, it is often the wok. It's an interesting one, Dave, because I think probably a lot less so in the build to rent, because I think people are moving in from a rental perspective in terms of what's there, how can we work with what we've got, rather than a build to sell perspective in terms of this is what we want. So I think it's much less so. To be absolutely fair, in our first build to rent, which was actually a converted build to sell over in Sydney Olympic Park, we do have gas cooktops, but the rest of them are moving to all electric induction units. That's all the ones in development. I don't think we'll see anywhere near as big an issue in the build to rent as we do in the build to sell piece. And I think even in the build to sell, I think it is moving. I think we are starting to see that difference. And to be fair, like Stephen says, I think a lot of the issues are probably more in the food and beverage type kitchen, which is quite a challenging space. If we can make it easy for people, I think that goes a long way to actually allaying some of these fears. If we can come up with a good alternative, if we can't, then so be it. But as long as we can put a good alternative in place, I think possibly a bigger challenge for build to rent really quickly is just to focus on how we deal with things like domestic hot water up front, because there are refresh rates. If you've got a building with a few hundred apartments, everybody wants to have a shower before they leave the building. How do you deal with that with heat pumps, with storage? It's a little bit more of a challenge. We can certainly do it, but it's just a little bit more of a challenge from a spatial or an acoustic perspective.
Yeah. So what we really need is a electrification guide, Taryn, to help everyone answer those questions. So that
let me come back to you in February on that.
Yeah.
Actually, if I could just butt in here a little bit, David, I think there's kind of 2 points to that I'd like to make. One is the macro view, and that's about the fact we don't have all of the answers right now, and that's why I think setting those targets and that trajectory is a really important part. And it's, I'm speaking from a Green Star perspective, but I know obviously a lot of people on the call have ambitions for 2030 and 2040. But never underestimate the value of having those targets, because you can always achieve those earlier, but if you don't set them, you're going to run out of time. I think the second piece, which is really more to the micro, and I suppose to Stephen's point around the fact, I think in particular at the GBCA, we're definitely not cooking experts, but we are very keen to partner with people who are. And so one of the things that we're doing is to start a little bit of a movement around cook safe, and the benefits of electric cooking, and trying to find some solutions for those problems, because we know that that's not something that's just going to be solved by purely technology or purely demand. So how we can find collaborators within the kind of F&B spaces in particular. The more that when we look at those electrification guides, we've found so much activity that's actually just happening in tandem. Both, the PCA is doing a bit of work, but also F&B consultants are seeing this as an emerging trend. And so how we get people together and kind of create some collective guidance and really work with people on that behavior and I suppose education over time as well is going to be really important in the next 3 to 5 years, I think.
Excellent, Taryn. Well, I'm looking at the clock here and I'm doing a terrible job of keeping us on time because there's so much I think to talk about just on this topic. So I'll just move us along to tenant electricity consumption. As I showed before, it's between 40 to 80% of the total electricity consumption of a building, and many tenants are not really thinking about this, but like Stephen had said, it's not that they don't care, it's just not necessarily at the forefront of what they're doing when they're focused on running their business. So how can landlords help tenants reduce their electricity consumption? So on that again, Mo, from a sort of engineering perspective, design perspective, where's the low-hanging fruit for energy savings in the design and upgrade of typical tenancy fit outs?
Well, I think the easiest fruit that you could pick from this is probably the lighting design, to be quite honest. If you start looking at your lighting design and working on passive lighting solutions, try to work with your trying to let lateral light in, minimize the electrical consumption during the day where you can. Second step is to put lights where light's needed and try to focus your lighting energy where it's needed rather than trying to generally light a space to a specific lux level. It's working with lighting designers to come up with the right strategies to enable put light where it's needed and minimize it, and to put effective controls in. Being able to isolate zones, switch zones on where they're needed and how they're needed to really get effective use of light, because you don't want to just light areas up unnecessarily. I think if there's a thought about early in the design phase or at any point, even when you're in an existing building refitting it, I think if you think about these things and implement them, that's an opportunity to save a lot of energy. The other one's probably supplementary air conditioning. A lot of tenants will always come in, they'll have needs for additional cooling, whether it be in commercial spaces, meeting rooms, or they have high occupancy rates in areas that they need to cool greater. It's trying to find mechanisms to provide passive solutions in there, increasing the outside air to improve indoor air quality, but also minimizing energy consumption by putting in economy cycles and providing CO2 control to minimize your energy consumption there, and try to use natural ventilation wherever possible. Probably the last one to think about is probably server rooms. When you talk about computing power, that can compute a lot of power in any fit out. And if you can push that offsite as we move into the cloud computing world and everyone's moving the service offsite, that can reduce energy consumption quite considerably. But also those larger sites, hyperscale data centers or larger data centers, can have better economies of scale from an energy perspective when they're using those facilities. And again, that's something to be considered about, and it's something we're working on from our data center experience point of view. We're doing a lot of data centers, hyperscale data centers, to enable that, and we can see a lot of that shift across there. But that's something to think about. But when you're looking at those providers, making sure that how they source their energy is important, because you don't want to move your energy from your location to somewhere else and and they're not working from a sustainable point of view and trying to offset their energy consumptions from a carbon perspective.
Yeah, I think a lot of the big IT companies have all made switches to be totally powered by renewable electricity. So, if you shift to a company that's doing cloud computing for renewable electricity, that's all contributing to being a zero carbon tenant. Michelle, from what are the, I think you spoke about it before with the guides, but sort of opportunities for landlords to sort of help retailers, particularly those independents and the small retailers, to consider and reduce their energy consumption, and to even just to sort of benchmark where they're at, so they understand what is their electricity bill good, bad, or indifferent compared to the shop next door. Is that something that SCA is looking at the moment to help them?
I think it's two parts to that question. I would agree with Mo very much that, you know, it's about that ability to engage early. So it's about having, you know, fit out guides that actually are helpful and useful. It's about being able to provide, you know, tips, ideas as to how they might actually be able to have, you know, energy efficient lighting or different options for different things, different materials. So it's about trying to actually provide that guidance and assistance. And as Stephen said, without, you know, being arrogant. So, you know, I think for us and for the mum and dad retailers that predominate our portfolio, I think one of the other most important things that we could do is actually help in clarifying and demystifying, you know, some of, you know, what net carbon, you know, is all about. And as the token non-technical person on this panel, you know, I think it was really evident in our business that it was really confusing. People really didn't understand, you know, what was, you know, net carbon versus zero carbon versus, you know, various different, you know, concepts. So I think one of the things that we could do most definitely is actually just helping demystify and clarify, and then helping to understand what is actually possible and how we might go about that. So that's, I think, the journey that we're on, and we're at the really early part of that journey, but it's really quite exciting to think about what's possible and how we might help make that possible.
Excellent, thanks, Michelle. And I suppose that also ties into the concept of making it easy for tenants to buy renewable electricity, you know, and just making it just the easy option is to buy renewables rather than to not buy renewables. And, you know, a lot of the big corporates and the big corporate tenants, you know, like the Coles and the Woolies have committed to 100% renewable electricity and using power purchase agreements to be able to buy that at basically the same cost they're buying electricity now. There's very little uplift to going renewables when you can purchase at scale, you know. And how can landlords then help their tenants tap into that power, you know, that purchasing power, you know, with through embedded networks and so on. And David, I'd like to sort of suppose ask you, what are some of the learnings that you've had from a Mirvac perspective on renewable electricity procurement, and then being able to on-sell that to tenants, and how receptive they've been to that?
Sure. I think we did our first deal a couple of years ago now in terms of renewable energy, and we took quite a low risk approach. So we did a renewable energy supply agreement, so very similar to a typical energy supply agreement, but we just added the renewable at the front end of it. The first thing we did really was understand the business, especially around time. It might be timelines. So for us, this might be the whale or particular leases when they run out. So we want to try and make sure everything lines up in terms of timing. I think another piece was really understand the appetite of the risk of the business, how far you want to go. So in terms of the term, how far do you want to take that out? There was a question before about cogeneration that popped up on the screen, and being one of those owners that does have cogeneration plants, you know, the 12 years energy supply agreements, it's certainly something to think about. And then what's important to the business, and we found that actually linkage was really important to us. So to be able to say, to be able to point to a supplier and to point to their renewable energy generators and say, well, that's where we purchase our certificates from, that was really important for us. I guess with that, then plan early, do your research, really understand the market. Because if you know that certain coal-fired generators are coming off at a certain point, then the chances are there's going to be market impacts associated with that. So if you can, get some expert advice and certainly plan when you're going to go to market. And one thing I'd also say with the renewables is really understand what the acceptance criteria is. It was a bit of a challenge. We didn't get burnt in the end, but it was a challenge in terms of, we usually use a letter of acceptance to take a contract. And we were in a deal recently where they actually wanted the full contract signed, which is a little bit more challenging when you've got to go through retail and heads of businesses to get that done. So it's probably the three big learnings for us. I think in terms of helping then other retailers or tenants go down the same path, we've tried to put things out there in terms of, this is what we did, this is how we did it. We've presented a number of forums around that. I think probably the most effective thing is on selling it through your embedded networks. So like I said, anybody on an embedded network with Mirvac, you purchase 100% renewables because we do. We just thought if we're doing it, that's exactly what we should be doing with our embedded networks. So I think coming back to Stephen and Michelle's point earlier, to try and make it easy for people. That would be the big learning for us.
Excellent. I've only got 5 minutes left, so I don't think we're going to have time to go through audience Q&A, so I'm going to apologise for that. But Stephen, I did want to ask you, just finishing off this conversation about the renewable electricity, because you know, Fraser set up their real utilities, and it was a requirement at Burwood Brickworks for all tenants to be on renewable electricity as part of that certification. So yeah, how easy was it to get everyone to do that, and did anybody choose not to have renewable electricity?
We've got an embedded electrical, thermal and water network, and all tenants are on 100% of it, and it wasn't a problem at all. And one of the reasons for that is that, and coming back to this idea of partnering, is the desire to include scope 3 emissions was the key, because if you've got an embedded thermal network, there's a conflict of interest if you're building a base building, because the less efficient it is, kind of the more money you could potentially make as a thermal network provider. Like, that's the truth. And the same is true of electricity, right? Say for lighting, etc. So our sort of approach was, every time a tenant uses electricity, in this case, it's going to be renewable. We have like PPAs or large scale certificates to actually cover that, especially when we're not generating on site. And so there's a stake that we're putting in. So the more energy a tenant uses, there is a slightly higher financial burden on the landlord. And so there's a double incentive, you know, to try and reduce that. Because even if it is renewable, it's still using energy that may not be necessary, right? So I think the key to it is actually saying, we're in this with you, to the point that every time you have a light on that doesn't need to be on, that's costing us money too. And I think if you go in with that approach, you really do change, as I mentioned right at the beginning, how you approach all of these things. But in general, that has really helped, because every single tenant has been completely fine with all the 3 networks that we've got.
Excellent. Well, we've only got 2 minutes left, and so many more. We haven't even really got onto embodied carbon and waste and so on. So in the very short time available, just maybe go around all the panelists to, you know, a quick 1-sentence thing on, is there a lesser known barrier to tenants engaging in zero carbon? So something that's not come up today, just or the other way to turn that around is, what are the opportunities that exist that aren't being realized? So very, very quick, here's an opportunity to help tenants that we haven't really had time to discuss today. So I'll go around on my screen. So David, you're unlucky, you get less time to think about it.
Oh, no. I think for me it would be use neighbours co-assess. You know, if you're in an office building, use neighbours co-assess. You know, it will be cheap, if not no cost at all, and it will give you a good benchmark of where you stand.
Excellent. Taryn?
I would just say really that it is, there are opportunities. I mean, you know, I'll leave it to the rest of the panel to really speak to what those are, but to not see it as a burden or a barrier. I've definitely had people in the past say to me, tenants, they're not our problem, it's outside of our control. But I think the more that you start to think about what's in your control in terms of influence, that's a really powerful motivator.
Excellent. Mo?
I think from my perspective is to set your objectives early and work collaboratively in a cost-effective way to achieve it, and design early in thinking about how you're going to get there. That's the key to making it work, and that's easily done when you plan ahead.
Excellent. Michelle?
As I said before, I think really the opportunity is in demystifying, clarifying, and then really helping from the outset, and genuinely trying to help and partner to help provide solutions and opportunities for our retail partners.
Excellent. And Stephen?
Maybe all landlords could take an opportunity to become a tenant. Maybe Fraser's could run its own restaurant or something, and I think we'll build up a lot more empathy and understanding of the issues, you know, firsthand in a lived experience.
Excellent. Right, well, we're unfortunately out of time. I'm sure we could carry on this conversation for at least another hour or so, particularly when we get into embodied carbon and things like carbon offsets. So maybe that's a webinar for another day. So I would just like to thank my the panelists for joining today, for sharing your insight and your knowledge to help us all understand how we, you know, that zero carbon tenants is possible. And not only is it possible, it's absolutely essential and fundamental if we're going to have zero carbon buildings. We can't have a zero carbon building if it's only half the carbon in the building. So I think this is a really important conversation that we need to have, and we need to drive that forward. And one of the key things that has come out of today is the need for collaboration, and the collaboration between landlords and tenants to all work together to drive this forward. So if we're doing this live, I'd ask everyone to give a round of applause to thank the panelists. But yes, everyone that asked questions, we will endeavour to get responses back to you. This webinar has been recorded, and we will share it. And thank you everyone for sending in your poll responses. We'll be collating those globally, and we'll share those with everyone. So all that information will be up at some point on our website, so cundall.com, and we'll email around everybody that registered for this to show you where those links are. So once again, thank you very much, everyone, and have a good day. Cheers.